Thank you so much. Thank you to the organizing committee for having me here. Grateful to be here. I'm going to share a little bit about spiritual yearning amid religious change. But I also want to share my gratitude with the John Templeton Foundation for their support of this research, particularly 2 grants that I got over the past several years. Okay, so we're going to start with a big question. Here's the big question of today's keynote talk. Where do non-religious individuals seek existential meaning outside of traditional religious structures? So for people who are not religious, where do they seek to satisfy their need for existential meaning? Okay, so this is Positive Psychology 2.0, right? Regular positive psychology focuses a lot on the good. The Positive 2.0 brings in the existential, the negative. So if you'll indulge me for just a few minutes, we'll get more existential, we'll get a little bit more negative. Is that okay? I know it's early before lunch. We'll get a little bit more negative. So here's your daily reminder that every human has to come to terms with 5 existential realities. So this is, every human has to come up with solutions or answers to these big existential realities. So the first is what researchers call groundlessness or freedom. So groundlessness or freedom is the realization that all of us have to make decisions, seemingly competingly attractive decisions, in a world without structure where we don't know what the right answer is, right? So we don't know, what should my profession be? Whom should I marry? Where should I live? We don't know the answers to those questions, and we have to bear the responsibility of those decisions, right? You have to bear the responsibility of whom you marry, what you should do for a profession, where you should live. The second existential reality is that every single one of us is completely isolated from everybody else. We enter into this world alone, we depart from this world alone. And now existential isolation is not loneliness, right? You can't solve this by having a lot of friends. Because even if you have friends, there's always going to remain between you and the other person an unbridgeable gap where they will never know what it is like to be you, and you will never know what it is like to be them. So all of us are having completely phenomenologically unique and subjectively distinct experiences right now. Right? Some of you are wondering how much more depressing I'm going to get. Others of you are wondering what's on the lunch menu today. I'm hoping that I'll maintain your interest through the entire talk. But none of us knows what it's like to be anyone else. And that's why we say things like, I need you to see me. I need you to validate me. I need you to affirm me. Because what that does is it reminds you that you're not as alone in this world. The third existential reality that we all have to come to terms with is navigating an uncertain identity. So who am I? Right? This is a perennial question. How many of you teach undergraduate college students? Any of you work with okay. Your students are wrestling with these questions. Who am I? Right? What's my purpose? So figuring out our identity and coming to terms with an ever-changing identity across the developmental arc is an existential question. Now, we might not know what the right decision to make is. We might not ever feel truly connected and might continually feel isolated. We might always be wrestling with our identity, but we do know one thing is certain, right? There is one certainty in life. Anyone know what the certainty in life is? Yes, we're all going to die. All right. Oh, it's already getting more encouraging, right? This is the one certainty in life, is every single one of us is bound to die. And we might argue that we're the only species acutely aware of our own death. Every morning, my dog wakes up so happy to be alive, runs and gets its food, chases squirrels out in the backyard, blissfully unaware that one day it's going to die. But we are not unaware. We realize, like every other organism, we too will one day perish. And so when we take these 4 existential concerns together, it gives rise to a 5th existential concern, and that's meaninglessness. Meaninglessness is where we have to ask ourselves, is there any bigger point to this world? Is there any grand meaning? And if there is, why can't we all agree on what that is? So the potential for us, so engaging with these and the awareness of these existential concerns gives rise to the potential for overwhelming anxiety. Some of us are already feeling a little bit anxious. You're asking yourself, why is this guy reminding us of all these horrible things? It's a lovely summer day. So when we encounter these existential realities, it gives rise to the potential for overwhelming anxiety that we have to manage in some way. So my sense is that as I was going through these different existential realities, some of you might have already been coming up with explanations for why you're actually not that worried about these things at all, right? So if I mention to you, oh, I'm going to die, some of you, if you're religious, you're like, well, I've got that sorted out. I'm not too worried about death because I believe in something after death, right? Or if I say, a lot of people are struggling with their meaning, you might chuckle and say, well, I feel sad for them, but I know what my meaning is. And the way in which researchers have argued that we come to terms with and manage the potential anxiety that comes from an awareness of these existential concerns is by constructing and adhering to what are called cultural worldviews. So cultural worldviews are systems of meaning. They help us answer these big questions about life. Now, religion is a prototypical worldview. It's perfectly suited to address existential questions. In fact, if I was going to start from scratch and design a cultural worldview that I thought humans would be most attracted to and would persist for millennia, I would choose religion. In fact, I think religion answers these questions maybe better than anything else. Because think about it. Religion helps answer the question of, what decision should I make? Well, you could seek transcendent or supernatural intervention or guidance. You can feel less alone and isolated and more connected to something bigger than yourself. It gives you an identity, and it gives you a strong sense of meaning. But religion can also do something that no other worldview, no other secular worldview can do, and that's that it solves the problem of death, right? It solves the problem of death. And religion has, people have relied on religion to manage these fears, right? So whereas other people might seek symbolic immortality, right, by attaching their name to a philanthropic endeavor, like putting their name on a building or passing on their legacy with children, religion solves the problem of death by just transcending death, by making death not an issue at all. So there's a Hollywood film director, Woody Allen, who says, I don't want to achieve immortality through my art. I want to achieve immortality by not dying. Right? He said, I don't want to live on in the hearts of my countrymen. I want to live on in my apartment. Religion offers that. But that's changing. It's changing. And right now, what we are seeing across the world, the United States in particular, but across the world, is a shifting religious landscape. The number of religiously unaffiliated individuals and populations grew in 35 different countries. And in fact, Christianity was the religion that lost the most affiliates between 2010 and 2020. So 35 countries grew in religious unaffiliated by at least 5%, and at least 40 countries lost at least 5% of their Christian population. About a quarter of the world's population is religiously unaffiliated. China has 7 times as many religiously unaffiliated individuals as the US and Japan combined. And the Netherlands, New Zealand, and Uruguay now have in their countries the religiously unaffiliated as the largest majority of a religious identity group. In the US in particular, according to Pew Research, in the past 30 years, the number of Christians has dropped from 90 to 63%. By 2070, estimates are that, similar to many of these other countries, Christianity will no longer be a majority religion in the United States. But lost in many of these statistics are the fact that among these religious nuns, so by religious nuns we mean when asked what's your religious affiliation and they say, well, none. 3/4 were once religious. They've walked away from their faith. And in fact, 1 in 3 individuals raised Christian will leave the faith by the time they reach age 30. So among these religious nuns are what we call religious duns. And so these are people who have left religion. They're done with religion. They no longer identify as religious. But why is it that people are leaving? Why are people leaving religion? My colleagues and I analyzed research from other scholars. We collected our own data. And what we found is 4 main reasons why people are leaving. And we call this the 4 horsemen of religion's apocalypse. So this is not of the religious apocalypse, but if religion were going to have an ending, we think this is why. The first reason why people are leaving is because they've experienced religious or spiritual abuse or trauma. So they've experienced suffering or adversity that they just can't make sense of. A second is because of what we would call belief misalignment. So cognitively, they've grown or they've changed in a way where they no longer hold the same beliefs that their religious teachings or religious institutions hold. They become more progressive and often their religious institutions remain stagnant. A third reason is social. Their community has let them down. They feel like their community has been judgmental, or they perceive hypocrisy in their religious community. And finally, a developmental reason is that some people just feel that they've outgrown religion. It's just faded away. It's lost relevance in their life. And so as people are leaving religion, part of what we've focused on is what we call religious de-identification. So this is the process of leaving religion. We had a paper that came out 2 years ago where we look at the different dimensions of leaving religion. So some people cognitively might disbelieve. They may stop believing in God or supernatural agents. Or people might disengage, so they emotionally withdraw from their transcendence. They may discontinue following religion's practices, and that's the moral dimension of religious de-identification. Or they might disaffiliate, and they might withdraw from their religious community. And now each of these are associated with a host of religious and spiritual struggles. And so with Julie Exline, 3 years ago, we published a paper that found that when people are pulling away from religion, they report greater religious and spiritual struggles. So when we look at people who are disengaged but spiritual, or disengaged but religious, they report the highest degree of religious and spiritual struggles. We also know that when people are pulling away from religion, when people are de-identifying from religion, they have poor mental health. So we did a cross-cultural study from participants in the United States, from Hong Kong, and from the Netherlands. And we did a latent profile analysis where we tried to develop 2 types of religious duns. And so one type of the religious duns were those who were completely done. They had discontinued completely. And then we found religious duns who were still practicing. So they no longer identified as religious, but they were still going to church or temple or mosque. They were still praying. They were still meditating. Which group do you think had better mental health? The totally discontinued duns or the still practicing duns? Which one had better? So we thought that the still practicing would have better mental health. We were totally wrong. Yeah, we were completely wrong. In fact, it was the discontinued religious duns who had better mental health. And we were a little bit surprised by this. We thought, well, there's all this research that shows religion is good for mental health. Why is it that the still practicing duns have such poor mental health? And then I went to a conference. I was reminded of this conference I went to years ago. My wife had introduced me to this conference, and it was people who had left evangelical Christianity. So they didn't call themselves evangelicals, they called themselves ex-evangelicals. And I met a pastor at this conference. I had a breakout session, and he turns to me and he says, "Can I tell you something I haven't told anyone except my wife?" And I'm like, "Oh gosh, is he?" I thought he was going to confess a crime. And so I said, "Well, what is it?" And he said, "Well, I'm a pastor, but I don't believe in God anymore." I said, "Oh, okay, that's big news." And he said, "But I'm about 6 or 7 years from retirement, so I'm not going to quit. I'm not going to tell anybody this. I'm going to keep my job." And I thought, I can't imagine the mental anguish that would have to go into being that person, right? The amount of cognitive dissonance of outwardly projecting one identity, but secretly holding another. And then when I saw these findings, I thought of that pastor and I thought, oh, that makes sense. That makes sense, because if cognitive dissonance could be undermining people's well-being. The other thing we know about religious duns is that they're socially isolated. So we did a study that we called a sheep in wolf's clothing. And for those of you who are aware of the Christian version of this, it should actually be a wolf in sheep's clothing. So some of you are like, oh no, he has a typo, but I'll explain it to you. It's not a typo. So we asked currently religious people, never religious people, and then religious duns, or formerly religious, to rate all the other groups. And here's what we found. Religious duns, so these are people who have left religion, face what we call a social isolation paradox. Here's what we mean. Currently religious folks really like religious duns. So the currently religious, they like people who have left. And when we ask them why is that? It's because they think that they're going to come back to religion. They're like, oh, they're just having an adolescent temper tantrum. They're going to come back. But ironically, when we asked the religious duns, are you going to come back? Guess what they say? No, no way. They're like, I am done. I am not becoming more religious. The religious duns really like the never religious. They love the never religious, but the never religious don't like the religious duns. And when we ask them why, it's because they don't trust them. They said, once you've been religious, there might be something about you. We don't trust you. So the group that the religious duns like, the never religious, don't like them.
Dad?
Likes the religious duns don't like. So they're trapped in between. The group they like doesn't like them. The group that likes them, they don't like. So what they tend to do is just spend time with other religious duns and talk about how terrible religion was. The other thing this means is that the religious duns conceal their identities. So again, looking at these data we collected from the US, Hong Kong, and the Netherlands, what we find is that in religious settings, religious duns tend to hide the fact that they're done. There's a lower degree of public-private overlap in their identity. The problem with that, though, downstream, is it erodes their sense of belonging. Because if you're in a religious context and you're a religious dun, you might not want to tell people that because you don't want to face the consequences. But over time, that means you're less connected with people because they don't really know who you are. So all of this research together revealed probably one of our biggest takeaways from this line of research, and it's something that we call religious residue. Religious residue is this. After people have left religion, they still think, act, and feel in ways that are decidedly religious, much more than people who have never been religious. So religion is sticky. It's hard to get rid of. And you can't just wake up one morning and say, oh, I've been religious for 35 years, but today, nope, I'm leaving it all behind. The mind, the body, the brain does not work that way. And so we did a series of correlational, longitudinal, so many studies. There were correlational, longitudinal, self-report, implicitly measured, behavioral indices. We've sampled from Hong Kong, Netherlands, New Zealand, United Kingdom, United States to provide evidence. Our signature paper came out in 2021 in Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, JPSP, and we found across a whole host of religion and religion-adjacent domains evidence for religious residue. We also found religious residue in morality and in personal values. So the way that it looks is something like this. Religious dones more closely resemble the currently religious than the never religious do. There's some features of religion that stick around. This religious residue, though, can be psychologically taxing. So for example, my wife and I were having a discussion one day. So she's a therapist. She's a licensed clinical social worker. A number of the clients she sees are clients who are undergoing religious change. And so some of them have stopped believing in God, the supernatural. But when, we were over dinner one time, we were talking, and she said, there's one area that these folks who have left religion can't get rid of, and that's their fear of hell and the devil. And I said, really? Hell and the devil? That seems like that would be like the first thing to go, like, right? Why would you still hold on to that belief? And so my wife, she's very wise, way wiser than I am. She said, okay, well let's do a thought experiment. I said, okay. So I was raised in the 1980s, 1990s, and in the United States, there was this urban legend among evangelical Christians, like how I was raised, this urban legend where if you go into the bathroom and you turn off all the lights and you look in the mirror and you say Bloody Mary 3 times, this horrible apparition is supposed to show up, right? Have any of you heard of this before? Okay, a few of you have. Some of you are nervous for me. Okay. So we're at dinner and my wife says, okay, well, do you believe in that Bloody Mary thing? And I said, oh, no, that's childish. I don't believe in that. She said, okay, well, you go to the bathroom right now and do it. And I said, no way. And she said, well, why wouldn't you do it? And I said, well, I don't want to take that risk. Like, what's the point? Like, it seems like such high risk, low reward. Why don't you do it? And she said, oh, no, I can't do it either. And so she said, you've got to study this. So the next day I came to my lab and I told my students, we've got to study to see whether or not people who have left religion are still afraid of hell and the devil. And sure enough, what we find is that religious dones still maintain a greater belief in hell and the devil than people who have never been religious. And this even holds for atheist dones. So people who have left religion sooner stop believing in God than they do hell and the devil. Well, why might that be? There's 2 reasons. One is we know from a lot of research, bad is stronger than good, right? There's the negativity bias. And so it's possible that these negative behaviors linger. But also, if you're wrong about hell, you might spend all of eternity realizing that you're wrong, right? It's a very high stakes belief. We also know that religious dones report a higher degree of what we call religious cognitive dissonance. So we ask them, how good do you think God should be theologically? And how good do you experience God to be experientially? And what we find is that they expect God, religious dones expect God to be pretty good, but they don't actually experience God to be particularly good or benevolent. But critically, that discrepancy between how theologically, how benevolent they think God should be, but in their life, how benevolent God has been to them, that discrepancy, that dissonance, is associated with negative attitudes toward God, both implicitly and explicitly. So it could be driving some of this negative sentiment that they have. They thought that God was going to be good, and God didn't deliver in their minds. One of the big takeaways, if we're piecing all of this together, if religion is supposed to be this great existential cultural worldview that provides existential meaning, after religious dones walk away, we find that their meaning in life erodes. And so we have a series of studies in the United States, and then we also have a longitudinal study in New Zealand that finds life loses meaning after you leave religion. Life is just less meaningful. And so with this lack or this loss of meaning, it opened us up to a broader question. And that is, how do people, that's that opening question that I started with, how do people satisfy their need for meaning outside of traditional religious structures, which are so effective at providing a sense of meaning? There's this Calvin and Hobbes cartoon that I like. Calvin says, what if there's no afterlife? Suppose this is all we get. And so they both think about it, and Hobbes says, oh, what the heck, I'll take it anyway. And Calvin says, yeah, but if I'm not going to be eternally rewarded for my behavior, I'd sure like to know now. So where we came to with this quest for existential meaning is a concept that we call spiritual yearning. And so we define spiritual yearning as the motivation for deeper existential meaning and security through a connection with something greater than oneself. So the idea here is that we don't believe and we don't think that people necessarily have to identify as religious in order to deal with and have spiritual needs or motivations. And so we think that they long for something deeper in 4 different ways. So they might yearn to believe in something greater. So even if they're not religious, they might yearn to believe in something greater. And so that could be something like a cause, right? Like justice or some type of bigger, something that's bigger than themselves. They might yearn for transcendent connection. They might yearn for moral guidance, discernment, or structure, and they might yearn to connect with a broader community. So we think that there are that these yearnings cut across the different ways that people might have left religion. And so what I'm going to share with you today with the remainder of the time before the Q&A is just some initial empirical research that we've done on spiritual yearning. So I'm going to report 7 different studies, mostly done from the United States and the United Kingdom, looking at, well, what is spiritual yearning? How is it separate, distinct, or related to other constructs? Is it a state? Is it a trait? And what happens when we either fulfill or don't fulfill these spiritual yearnings? So in study 1, we just wanted to map the conceptual territory of spiritual yearning. So we recruited 200 participants in the United States, United Kingdom. It was a largely white and heterosexual sample. They were fairly politically liberal from a 1 to 7 scale, and had left. And among those who had left religion, so these were all non-religious individuals. Among those who had left religion, they left a moderately religious past. So what we did is we recruited them if they said that they were yearning for something more or longing for something more. It kept it very vague. And then we had them write about what they were yearning for and then complete a self-report items. So regarding their religious beliefs and practices, it was about equally split between spiritual but not religious and neither spiritual or religious. 2/3 had never been religious, 1/3 were religious duns. Most of them had totally left religion. They experienced a moderate level of yearning. We also found that people long for community and belief, and they report that it's mildly positive to yearn. So it's not this negative feeling like, oh, I'm yearning for something more, it's terrible. It's like, yeah, I kind of wish there were more, and that's okay. So when we asked them, to rank what they're yearning for, people long for meaning, purpose, and deep connection. Those are the top things that people are yearning for. But if you look all the way at the bottom of the table, they don't want it with God, at least these non-religious people. So I want this deep meaning and purpose to my life. I want this life to have a deeper meaning. I want a sense of connection with humanity and with nature. But the sample said, I don't want it from God. So when we looked at how frequently they yearned, they kind of like mild, it was kind of this moderately frequent yearning. It wasn't a lot. And they were mildly positive yearnings. So we also see that religious duns still maintained greater beliefs in supernatural agents. They felt closer to the transcendent. They lived according to religion's moral codes and were part of a community, providing, again, additional evidence for religious residue. So then what we did is we analyzed their written responses of what is it that you're actually yearning for. So tell us what you want out of this life. And we used Luke software to identify 6 themes. So one is just kind of general spiritual yearning. The second was they talked about how they were struggling with death, how death would be a problem now, which makes sense. Some were yearning for the benefits of religion. Some were yearning for relationships. Others saw questioning essential to their spiritual yearning. And then some really wanted a meaningful impact. But then we also used human coders, and I know that sounds really antiquated after the first talk to use human coders. But they went through and they identified, kind of combining the Luke analysis and the human coders, 4 themes. So here are the 4 themes. One is this grief of having lost religion, this transcendent peace and connection, existential meaning, and supernatural experiences. So when we take all of those together, we think that there are 4 primary domains. So the first thing that people want is to replace religion's functions. I thought this was so fascinating. They don't want religion, they want something kind of like religion, right? So give me religion, but hold the God stuff. The second thing that they want is they want relational connection, right? We know that relationships are the bedrock of meaning, and they want relational connection. They want ultimate meaning and lasting impact, so they want their life to matter. And this one is so fascinating. They want supernatural experiences. I'd like look at the data again. I'm like, wait a minute, you don't want religion, but you want supernatural experiences? Now, in the United States, where this is coming up a lot, is through this overwhelming desire for psychedelics. So I'm not sure if that's happening much in this country, but a lot of people are saying, oh, I want psychedelics. But the people who want the psychedelic experiences are the middle class, religiously disaffiliated, right? They're bored. They're existentially bored. And they're saying, oh, give me these psychedelic experiences because I want to connect with the transcendent. Okay. So after this, what we did was we developed a multidimensional assessment of spiritual yearning. So things that assessed their desire for ultimate answers, spiritual experiences, transcendent interconnectedness, communal belonging, inner peace, existential hope, moral guidance, and meaningful legacy. And so we were just curious, well, how much do people regularly experience spiritual yearning when we don't ask them, are you longing for something more? So we sampled 1,000 individuals from the US, United Kingdom, who completed this new 9-item measure of spiritual yearning. And what we found is that spiritual yearnings are modest at best, and they're modestly frequent. And on a scale of 1 to 100, they're fairly positive. People enjoy experiencing these emotionally. They're a little emotionally negative, and they're only slightly associated with perceptions of loss. And when we look at, across the different religious identity groups, religious people have the highest spiritual yearning, followed by religious duns, and then the never religious. Okay. So in the next few studies, what we wanted to do was see whether or not spiritual yearning was distinct from other related concepts like quest religiousness, and see if it was related to other outcome variables that we thought should be associated with spiritual yearning. And so in the third study, what we found is that spiritual yearning is related to religious and spiritual struggles and a search for and need for meaning. And this is above and beyond quest religiousness. So this is uniquely predictive. So it uniquely predicts religious and spiritual struggles, search for meaning, need for meaning, and meaningfulness above and beyond quest religiousness. So it's not just quest religiousness, it's doing something a little bit more. We replicated this in a separate sample in study 4, finding the exact same thing plus associations with anger toward God. And then in study 5, we extended this to also look at religious cognition. So we said, we're curious what you think about God. And so what we found is spiritual yearning is related to a search, again, replicated the same thing, as well as viewing God as benevolent, limitless, mystical, and ineffable. And when we look at unique predictions, We also see God as loving. So when we kind of take all this together, what we see is spiritual yearning. People who are spiritually yearning, they might be struggling. They're searching for meaning. They need meaning, and they view God as mystical. So in the sixth study, we were curious, is spiritual yearning a trait or is it a state, right? Is it something I kind of move in and out of, or am I like this chronic spiritual yearner? Like, am I always just kind of religiously disaffected, or what William James might call the sick soul? And so we did a mini longitudinal study in the United States where they completed a baseline assessment on day 1, and then the next day, and then the next day, and then 2 weeks later. We also did this on either side of the United States presidential election, just to see if any of that changed, but we haven't looked at that feature of it quite yet. And what we found is that there's pretty high internal temporal consistency. So from day to day, spiritual yearning is pretty consistent, suggesting that it might be a little bit more trait-like. But where we do see variation, religious duns report the greatest variation. They're the ones that are moving day to day and have the most movement. And interestingly, that movement, that variance, so the standard deviation in someone's scores, is related to greater meaning in life at 3 out of the 4 time points, and marginally at the 4th time point. So the last study we wanted to do is we wanted to conduct an experiment to see what happens when these spiritual yearnings are fulfilled or unfulfilled. So we randomly assigned participants to write about a time when their spiritual yearnings were fulfilled, went unfulfilled, or tell us what you did yesterday. So just a neutral condition. And then they rated their existential security, so the degree to which their life felt meaningful or had a purpose or were satisfied, and then their emotions as well. And what we find is that recalling having your spiritual yearnings fulfilled is associated with greater existential security and more positive emotions than when these yearnings go unfulfilled. So if I said, yeah, but think about a time you really wanted there to be something more in life and, well, there wasn't. Well, you can imagine how existentially unsettling that would be. And it was much worse for religious duns. So for people who have left religion, and they were longing for something more and they didn't find that, it was significantly worse for them. So what are some conclusions that we can draw from these data? Well, spiritual yearning is the search for transcendent connection and meaning that looks a lot like an alternative to religion. It's modestly present among people with greater expressions among the currently and formerly religious, and it's associated with greater existential meaning. It's relatively stable, although religious duns exhibit the most variance, and that variance is associated with greater meaning. And when those yearnings are fulfilled, well, people feel like they have more existential comfort and security. And this is particularly the case among religious duns. So I think that spiritual yearning, especially for people who have left religion, is yearning for something familiar that feels new. So they want religious adjacent experiences. In the United States, there's a strong fascination with something called the Enneagram, which is something that seems like religion, but it's not quite. Many people are seeking out a non-religious spirituality. So connection with nature, connection with the cosmos, connection with other humans, or with an authentic sense of oneself. The one place where I have concern, though, is that a number of these people, if these longings are so intense, and if these longings feel so good to feel fulfilled, but feel so negative when they're unfulfilled, I'm concerned that some people might be vulnerable to people who might come in and try to capitalize on these spiritual yearnings by trying to sell them something to satisfy these yearnings. So, for example, we have a lot of life coaches, but in the United States, this is unregulated. There's no regulation on this, and a number of people are being exploited by this unregulated industry. We also see that political allegiances shift. So after people leave religion, they become much more politically liberal, but they often do so in ways that mirror their religious past. So you might imagine someone who was raised very fundamentalist, who believed there was a clear right and clear wrong, and anyone who didn't agree, they were intolerant to them. And then they shift and become politically liberal, and they think there's a clear right and clear wrong, and are completely intolerant to people who don't agree with them. And then we've also seen this increase in interest in psychedelic medication for trying to approximate some of these supernatural experiences that so many people are longing for. So the way that I think about this, and the image or metaphor that I use, is something called the existential chasm. So you can think about the existential chasm like this. I was talking about spiritual yearning amid religious change. If somebody was religious and all of their existential questions were neatly answered by religion, imagine leaving religion and you have to face afresh, brand new, for the first time in your life, these existential questions without the comfort of religion. That's terrifying. That's terrifying. If you previously had the answers and now you don't have the answers, if you no longer believe in life after death, you have to grieve that. If you no longer believe that there's a transcendent connection that will help you overcome isolation or give you a sense of identity or meaning, that's terrifying. And so on the one hand, there's a lot of fear, anxiety, and guilt associated with re-exposure to these existential concerns. And for some people who are raised in some religious traditions, they may not have the skills necessary to develop the critical thinking that's required to answer these existential questions. But on the other hand, people might experience awe, curiosity, and wonder at the opportunity to think about how to engage in these deep existential questions and address these big core issues about what it means to be human in a new way. And so they might have both the negative and the positive, which I think is a theme that we've already heard. It's a theme of Positive Psychology 2.0. They have guilt, anxiety, fear, but they also have curiosity, awe, and wonder as they reapproach these existential concerns. So non-religious spiritual yearning is an existential search for meaning in religious and spiritual struggles. It's distinct from other concepts like quest religiousness. And these spiritual yearners may think of God kind of mystically. And fulfilling these yearnings are very psychologically rewarding, whereas having these yearnings unfulfilled undermines existential security and is emotionally negative. So for us, where we're going, my colleagues and I, next steps, we're going to be doing future studies examining associations with degrees of religiousness and spirituality. We're going to be introducing existential threats to see whether or not people who are high on spiritual yearning kind of experience better or poorer outcomes. We're situating this construct within the idea of security versus growth. So maintaining a sense of existential security while balancing the human desire for expansion and growth. And we're about to, in the fall, launch a large-scale longitudinal study. We are seeking international collaborators to see how these processes may extend across other cultures. So if any of this has been interesting to you, feel free to send me an email or come chat with me. And then we're also trying to get this research into the hands of therapists and helping professionals. And so my wife and I are finishing, so she's a licensed clinical social worker. We're finishing a book for American Psychological Association on to train therapists to help clients who are undergoing religious change of all kinds. So I recently wrote a book. It came out a year ago called Done: How to Flourish After Leaving Religion. If you're interested in it at all, this is the QR code to the book. It does not go to my Venmo, I promise. Yeah, so this is just a QR code to the book if you're interested in looking at the book. Otherwise, I'll pause now and I'll open up the floor for shorter speeches disguised as questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for Professor Van Tongeren's insightful sharing on the religionist phenomenon that is growing more and more popular in the world. This may not be a good news, but I think all of us benefit. Now we are coming to the Q&A session. So I think we have about 10 minutes. Does anyone here have any question?
Thank you for your talk. Actually, I have done a research of some sort and found about 40 duns in my experiment. I'm trying to actually agree with what you have found, that they have certain religious residual. They still believe that if they pass away, if they do not believe in God, there's nothing they can bring from this world, something like that. And there is a difference between female and male too. And anyway, we are trying to bring these 40 people, these 40 duns back to religion. How can we use their residual as well as their anxiety to bring them back? This is what I am going to study.
Yes, so that's a good question. So the question is, in a study of religious duns, what role does residue or anxiety play in potentially bringing them back to religion? So I mean, I think we're still in the early phase of looking at religious duns over time. And so there could be certain situations in which after people have left religion, they may return, or they may return to a different form of religion. And so, for example, it could be the case that if people left religion in early adulthood, perhaps they return to religion when they have children, because they want their children to be raised in a certain religious tradition. If that's possible, we're not sure. It's also possible that when some people leave, they completely leave, and they may never come back. And some people have shared with me that because of abuse or trauma that they experienced, it doesn't feel safe for them to come back. And so for them, they would be seeking a spiritual connection outside of those traditional religious structures. So I don't think we know yet. I would love to do a big longitudinal study that followed people over time, so we could see people moving in and out, and we could see what predicted that movement, but I'm not sure that we have the data right now. But I'm glad that you're finding similar things in your data that we are in ours. That's good.
Any more questions?
Hello, thank you so much for the very, very insightful talk. I'm yearning for more. In one of your studies, longitudinal one, you mentioned that the religious nuns, the variation of the yearning is associated with meaning in life. And greater meaning in life. I was wondering about this constructive meaning in life. In a measure that I use, it includes two dimensions, the search and the presence. And they often show differential findings. So I was pondering about that. Could you talk a bit more?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so in that study, we just looked at the presence of meaning. So like my life has meaning. But the relationship between the search and presence for meaning is very confusing.
Yes, indeed.
There are times I will do studies and they are negatively related, right? So people have high presence, so they're not searching. There are other times they're orthogonal, so like they're just not related at all. There's other times they're positively related. I don't know that we as a field and as a set of scholars fully have a robust understanding of the search for meaning and what that actually means. If you or other people were to make a if you could figure that out, it'd be a wonderful contribution. Because I don't know that we have a clear sense about what the search for meaning actually is, but it feels like a very important construct, and people include it, but we never really know how to interpret it. So I'm finding similar things in my data as well.
That is probably particularly interesting for the religious nuns, because they are, abandoning or leaving something that they used to believe in and gave them meaning.
Yeah.
and they may be searching
Right.
at the moment.
Right, absolutely, yeah, and for the Duns, it's particularly, yeah, because they might be searching, and so, so you could think about them, it almost like, well, I have meaning, so I could have high presence, but I could also be searching for more, like, this is so great, I want more, so I could have high on both, or I could, you know, not have meaning, I could have a lack of presence, and so I could be searching to fill that presence, or I could, have plenty of meaning and not be searching, because I'm like, I've got enough, or I don't have any and I don't want any, and then I should probably see a therapist, right? So there's lots of, yeah, there's lots of ways that could look.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'd like to know whether there's potential to disaggregate your data in terms of age as a variable, in terms of level of education, in terms of type of religion, because there's so many when you talk about religion quite broadly. Yeah, whether there's any of that kind of more finer grained analysis. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for your comment. Yes, so those are questions that we are now turning to. So the data that went behind these studies were gathered from different cultures, different countries, a number of religions represented, although the spiritual yearning was mostly US and UK. And so that's probably a lot of people leaving some form of Christianity. We have been thinking more about, we're doing a study right now where we're looking at people leaving high cost religions. So by high cost, we mean the behavioral requirements to remain in that religion are significant, and the departure from that religion might be significant as well. So we're sampling and have already sampled people who are in the Latter-day Saint or Mormonism group. We have people from ultra-Orthodox Judaism, so people who are going to temple 21 times per week. Yes, so 3 times a day. Very insular evangelical fundamentalist Christians, and then we have a comparison group of just like nominally religious. So we're starting to really look at features of religion and types of religion. What we're underrepresented on probably, so we do have data from Hong Kong and from the past, but I don't think that we have as many Eastern religions represented as we ought to. So if any of you are doing research with Eastern religions and this is interesting to you, come talk to me. And then with age, yeah, so we're also curious right now, not only the age of the person, but the age at which they left, right? So if you were religious until you were 40 and you left at 40 and you're 43, that's very different than if you're 43 and you left when you were 12, or if you're 80 and you left when you, right, there's those different permutations. So we're starting to look at that as well.
Any more questions? Okay, so
Thank you.
I think this session is coming to an end. Thank you everyone for your participation, and thanks again for Professor Van Tongeren's insightful sharing.